In 2019, a ranger patrolling a remote backcountry trail in Yellowstone picked up a radio transmission that froze him in place.
Echo!
The voice
Get
on the
out!
radio
They're everywhere!
belonged
Get
to
out
another
now!
a ranger who had officially been missing for 3 days. Across America's national parks, rangers quietly deal with strange situations that rarely make it into public reports. Some of these incidents are so disturbing that many rangers are trained to avoid talking about them at all. Glacier National Park, Montana, 2017. Late September is when Glacier begins to empty out. Most tourists leave, the weather turns colder, and the backcountry trails become quiet again. Ranger Daniel Ortiz had been assigned to a routine patrol along the Sia Pass Trail. The job was simple: check for abandoned campsites, make sure seasonal hikers had cleared out, and log any unusual wildlife activity. The first few miles were completely normal. The forest was silent except for wind moving through the pines. About 4 miles into the trail, Ortiz noticed something strange. There was a campsite set up beside a creek. A tent. A small fire pit. A backpack leaning against a log. But there was no one there. At first that wasn't unusual. Hikers sometimes wander off to explore nearby areas. But the longer Ortiz stood there, the more unsettling the scene became. The fire pit still contained warm ashes. A metal cup was sitting beside the fire, half full of cold coffee. It looked like whoever had been there had just stepped away. Ortiz called out several times. No answer. He radioed the station to report an abandoned campsite and started documenting the scene. That's when he noticed the footprints. A single set of boot prints led away from the campsite and toward the tree line. But after about 20 yards, they simply stopped. The ground beyond that point was soft dirt. There should have been more tracks. Instead, the forest floor was completely untouched. No signs of turning back. No signs of wildlife. Nothing. Search teams later combed the entire area. The owner of the backpack was identified as a solo hiker from Idaho. Despite days of searching, no one ever found another trace of him. The trail was quietly closed for the rest of the season. And the campsite where his footprints ended is still mentioned in ranger briefings to this day. Olympic National Park, Washington, 2018. The Hoh rainforest is one of the quietest places in the United States. The trees are so dense that sound barely travels, and the thick moss absorbs most noise. Ranger Melissa Grant had been working the late shift at a small backcountry ranger station deep inside the park. Just after midnight, the radio on her desk crackled to life. Normally, radio traffic that late meant one thing: an emergency. But the voice that came through wasn't calling for help. It was whispering. Grant turned up the volume. At first she thought the signal was distorted. The voice sounded distant and uneven, like someone speaking through a weak transmission. But as she listened closer, the message became clearer. Someone was repeating the same phrase over and over. Don't come down the trail. Grant tried responding. No reply. The voice kept repeating the warning. Don't come down the trail. She checked the radio channel. The transmission was coming from a ranger frequency used by patrol units. Grant pulled up the Ranger ID attached to the signal. The ID belonged to Ranger Thomas Hale. But Hale wasn't on patrol. According to the logbook, he had ended his shift hours earlier and returned to the main station nearly 20 miles away. Grant called the main station to confirm. Hale was there. He had been inside the building the entire evening. The whispering transmission continued for another 3 minutes. Then the radio suddenly went silent. Technicians later reviewed the radio logs. The signal had definitely come from somewhere inside the forest. But no ranger units had been in that area that night. And the voice on the transmission sounded exactly like Hale. Sequoia National Park, California, 2015. Summer patrols in Sequoia often involve checking remote trails where hikers sometimes wander off the main path. One afternoon, Ranger Michael Jennings received a call from 2 hikers who had just arrived at a ranger station. They claimed they had seen something disturbing along a trail called Sugar Pine Ridge. Jennings asked them to explain. The hikers described hearing someone calling for help deep in the forest. A woman's voice. At first they thought someone might be injured, so they left the trail and followed the sound. But the strange thing was that the voice always sounded the same distance away. No matter how far they walked, they would move closer to the direction of the voice. And it would move deeper into the trees. Jennings assumed it might have been an echo or some strange acoustic effect. Still, he decided to investigate. He hiked to the location the hikers described. About half a mile off the trail, he heard it. A faint voice. Calling for help. "Over here, please." The sound was distant but clear. Jennings called out. No response. He followed the sound deeper into the forest. For nearly 20 minutes, the voice stayed just ahead of him. Always the same distance away. Finally the sound stopped. The forest became completely silent. Jennings searched the area for over an hour. There were no footprints. No campsites. No signs that anyone had been there. When he returned to the trail, he noticed something unsettling. His own footprints were the only tracks in the dirt. No other prints had entered or left the area. The incident was logged as unexplained audio activity. Yosemite National Park, California, 2019. Yosemite's backcountry trails stretch for hundreds of miles. Most rangers rely heavily on radio communication when patrolling remote areas. Ranger David Lang was conducting a solo patrol along a rarely used trail near the park's northern boundary. Around dusk, his radio suddenly crackled with static. Then a voice came through. At first Lang thought it was another ranger trying to contact him. But something felt off. The voice was speaking slowly, repeating the same sentence. "Are you still there?" Lang responded. "This is Ranger Lang. Identify yourself." The radio went quiet. Then the voice came back. "Are you still there?" Lang checked the channel. No ranger IDs were showing up. Just static. The message repeated several more times. "Are you still there?" Lang eventually reached the end of his patrol route and returned to the station. When technicians checked the radio logs later, they found something strange. The transmission had been broadcast from Lang's own radio. At the exact same time he had been receiving it. Meaning the signal had somehow been coming from his own device. But Lang had never transmitted anything. And the voice on the recording wasn't his. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee, 2014. The Smokies are one of the most visited national parks in the country. But just a few miles from the main roads, the forest becomes incredibly remote. One evening, Ranger Tyler Brooks was responding to a report of an abandoned campsite along the Deep Creek Trail. When he arrived, the scene looked unusual. A large family tent had been set up beside the trail. Sleeping bags were inside. Food was still sitting on a portable stove. But there was no one around. Brooks began documenting the site when he noticed something odd. The entire campsite was surrounded by footprints. At least 5 different people had been walking around the tent. But none of the footprints led away from the campsite. Every track circled the area. Over and over again. Like the group had been pacing around the tent. Brooks followed the tracks carefully. They formed loops in the dirt. Dozens of them. Then suddenly, they stopped. All of them ended at the exact same point beside the tent. Search teams later investigated the area. No hikers had been reported missing. No vehicles had been left at the trailhead. The campsite was eventually dismantled. The footprints were never explained. Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado, 2020. Winter patrols in Rocky Mountain National Park are some of the quietest assignments a ranger can have. Snow covers most trails, and very few hikers venture into the backcountry. Ranger Luke Hammond was performing a snowmobile patrol along a closed winter route when he noticed something strange in the snow. Footprints. Bare footprints. They were small, possibly a child's. The temperature that day was below freezing. Hammond followed the prints along the trail. They continued for nearly half a mile. Then the prints turned off the trail and headed into the forest. Hammond followed carefully. The footprints continued through deep snow. No boots. No socks. Just bare human footprints. Then suddenly, they stopped. Not faded. Not covered by snow. Just stopped completely in the middle of the clearing. Hammond searched the surrounding area for hours. There were no other tracks. Nothing entering. Nothing leaving. Just a trail of bare footprints that ended in the middle of the forest. The incident was logged and filed. But no missing child reports were ever connected to the area. Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, 2019. Late one night, Ranger Andrew Keller was monitoring radio traffic at a small ranger outpost. At around 2:30 a.m., a call came through on the emergency frequency. The voice sounded panicked. Ranger Station. I'm lost. I can't find the trail. Keller asked for the caller's location. The person didn't answer directly. Instead, they said something strange. There are lights out here. Keller asked them to describe the lights. The caller hesitated. then said quietly, "They're moving through the trees." Keller tried to keep them calm and asked for any landmarks. The caller started breathing heavily. Then they said something that made Keller uneasy. "They're getting closer." Suddenly the radio went silent. Search teams were dispatched to the area the caller's phone signal had briefly connected from. But when they arrived, there was no one there. No footprints. No campsite. No signs anyone had been in the area. The phone number used to make the call was never identified. And no missing person report was ever linked to the incident. Mount Rainier National Park, Washington, 2016. A group of hikers reported seeing something unusual along the Wonderland Trail late one evening. They claimed they had passed a ranger walking alone along the trail. But something about him seemed wrong. The ranger had been standing perfectly still in the middle of the path. When the hikers approached, he slowly turned toward them. But he didn't say anything. He didn't even acknowledge them. The hikers continued down the trail, assuming he was focused on something else. About 30 minutes later, they reached a ranger station and mentioned the encounter. The ranger at the station looked confused. No one had been assigned to patrol that section of the trail that night. When they checked the area later, they found no signs that anyone had been there. But the hikers all agreed on one detail. The ranger's uniform looked outdated. Like something from decades earlier. The incident was filed and never publicly discussed again. Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona, 2013. During a routine patrol along a remote canyon trail, Ranger Carl Donnelly came across a campsite that looked like it had been there for a long time. The tent was partially collapsed. Cooking supplies were scattered nearby. But the strangest thing was the notebook lying beside the tent. Inside were pages of handwritten notes. At first they looked like normal journal entries. Descriptions of hiking routes. Weather conditions. Camp locations. But the entries slowly changed. The writer began describing hearing footsteps outside the tent at night. Footsteps that circled the campsite. Every night. Always just outside the firelight. The final entry in the notebook was written shakily across 2 pages. It read, "Whatever is walking out there, it knows I'm awake." There were no later entries. No missing hiker reports were ever connected to the campsite. And the owner of the notebook was never identified. Denali National Park, Alaska, 2021. Denali is one of the most remote national parks in the world. Thousands of square miles of wilderness where very few people ever go. Ranger Olivia Mercer had been assigned to monitor a remote research cabin deep in the park. One night, during a heavy snowstorm, the cabin's motion sensor alarm activated. Mercer checked the exterior camera feed. The camera showed the snowy clearing outside the cabin. At first nothing seemed unusual. Then she noticed something in the snow. Tracks. Large tracks. They circled the cabin slowly. Over and over again. But the camera never captured what was making them. The motion sensors continued triggering for nearly an hour. By morning, the storm had stopped. When Mercer checked the clearing in person, the tracks were still there. They circled the cabin dozens of times. But they never approached the door. And they never left the clearing. Just a continuous pattern of tracks going around the building. Like something had been watching the cabin all night. And sometimes, the strangest part of these ranger reports is that no one ever finds out what really happened.